Remarkable lot in common. One of them is bringing up children, another is dieting, which I've also done, and the third is controlling public expenditure. And in each case, an important part of the art or the skill or whatever it is the ability to say no and to stick to it. This is the essence of what the Treasury is about. If the Treasury had a motto, it would be the single word no, and it needs to be.
But the failure of governments to say no has had consequences. They keep spending money they haven't really got. It's how we've ended up with a deficit.
Britain has got a problem, a very big problem. And it's this. Last year, the government raised £549 billion in tax, but spent £692 billion, leaving a deficit or a gap of £143 billion. But now, just take a look at this. Here is government spending since the Second World War. It's measured as a percentage of the economy as a whole, or GDP, gross domestic product. The peaks are recessions, and you can see them here for the mid-70s, for the mid-80s, for the early 90s, and then finally for the banking crisis of 3 years ago, which helped create the largest deficit since the war. Now let's add a line for taxes, measured in exactly the same way as a share of the economy. Look how often spending is higher than tax. In other words, how often the economy is in the red, in good or bad times, whether there's a Labour or a Conservative government. Deficits have been the name of the game for pretty much all of the past half-century. Even so, today's deficit is a whopper. It may date from the banking crisis, but the last Labour government had been spending more than it got in taxes for 6 years running up to then. Gordon Brown used to say that he was borrowing to invest, but his critics said he should have been saving for a rainy day.
The reason we keep running up deficits is not just that politicians can't say no. It's that sometimes they behave like every day will be a day when the sun is shining.
It's a mistake that pretty much anybody really could make. Best explained perhaps by something that I like to do, or try to do, when I'm not covering politics.
You see, think of our politicians as sailors. Just like me today, they've got to judge the conditions as they decide how to spend and keep an eye out for storms on the horizon.
It's beautiful out here on the water, and when economic conditions are this good, no wonder our politicians are tempted to set a course to carry on increasing spending, as if it'll always be this way. After all, the sun is out, the wind is in our sails. But what we amateur sailors have to know is it can all change incredibly fast. And then we're in real trouble.
And that's what our politicians can forget, how fast the weather can turn, how bad the storms can be. And it's not just the last Labour government, because the Tories did it too.
Working for you now, working for you now.
Remember the late 80s? The economy was booming, the city was taking off, and the then Conservative government made a classic mistake. They thought it would go on forever and increase spending.
The mistake they made was that they thought that the tax revenue that was in fact coming from an overheated economy was coming from an economy that was working extraordinarily well. So they thought it would always be there. The analogy would be a naive young adult who thinks that because they've had a fabulous year in their business, it's going to be like that forever. And so they take on much larger liabilities than they really should, and they repent at their leisure.
By the early 90s, the Conservatives had a new Prime Minister. But then came a recession, which pushed spending up and tax revenues down. By 1993, they had a deficit of £50 billion.
We made a mistake in the late 80s. That was a tiny wobble compared with what's happened in the last 5 years, I have to say, difference of a degree. But it was a bit of the same thing, and it's been done by many countries, done by Britain frequently, ever since the war.
And guess what? Barely 10 years later, the Labour government would make exactly the same mistake, only in Technicolor. After 2 years' restraint, spending roared away.
We had to spend more money as a country because health is a matter of decency, education is a matter of our future. Now, it's sometimes difficult to remember when you look at new hospitals, new schools around the country now that they had to be paid for.
And while the economy boomed and the taxes rolled in, all seemed well.
In the middle of the boom, they misjudged it. The booms produced great tax revenues. Any government could borrow as much money as it liked. People like me or Vince Cable moaning away about deficit and debt were regarded as old-fashioned, miserable, didn't understand new politics, a new economic model.
But the government had missed something crucial about where a hefty chunk of all that money was coming from. Over the last 30 years, the Treasury has benefited from two vast windfalls. Not just North Sea oil, but also the one that people often forget, the City of London generating billions of pounds, which the government can spend. There is, of course, one major difference which the last Labour government was to discover. North Sea oil runs out very slowly, whereas the flow of cash from the city can run out just like that.
The big problem that we had is that we were very dependent on a flow of revenue from one particular source, and that was the financial services industry, a volatile sector that when it goes wrong, it goes very wrong. Whenever you're quite dependent on one source, and this is something been building up for decades, then you do have to ask yourself, what if? What if it stops? Or what if it slows down? What's your fallback position?
In the summer of 2008, his what-if moment arrived. The British economy was teetering on the brink of recession. Alistair Darling took top Treasury civil servants away for the day to Dorney Wood, the Chancellor's official country house.
It's an oasis of calm, really, and I wanted us to sit down and take stock. We were sitting in an armchair overlooking these delightful gardens in southern England, and we were talking about this, and the Permanent Secretary said, you know, borrowing could hit £100 billion. When you start talking about £100 billion, you know, that is serious money. That is when you think, yes, this is bad.
Is there an intake of breath?
Well, there was amongst some, I suppose.
Shaky of heads?
From my point, I've just come back from a Leonard Cohen concert, so actually I was quite, I was in quite a gloomy frame of mind anyway. So I thought, okay, fair enough, we'll just have to deal with it.
Dance me to your beauty with a burning violin. Dance me through the panic till I'm gathered safely in.
What had looked like a downturn had become a crash. The deficit would grow much larger than £100 billion, and ministers would spend even more trying to avert disaster.
Spend now and pay later. Labour's plan to avoid a long recession.
The country would soon want to know how it could all be paid for.
What happened when the financial crisis struck is that we knew immediately we had to accelerate out of the storm or be buried in it. The public were quite frightened of those telephone number figures that they saw, you know, on those, you know, BBC News reports at 10 o'clock. And they felt, hold on a moment, you know, we've got to do something about this, otherwise we're going to be saddling future generations with a colossal amount of debt, and that is not the responsible thing to do.
But for many months, Gordon Brown instructed his ministers not to even talk about the drastic measures which were sure to be needed to tackle the deficit.
Gordon's nervousness was that that would just sound like cuts.
He didn't want to use the C word at all, did he, the word cuts?
Well, we had so many discussions about this. I mean, been more than I could care to remember until we got to his TUC speech in September of 2009. And he used the word cuts, not once, not twice. I think it was something like 7 or 8 times.
Labour will cut costs, cut inefficiencies, cut unnecessary programmes, and cut lower priority budgets.
And he came back from Brighton or wherever it was and he said, OK, satisfied?
It was too late. By then, the sheer size of the deficit had damaged Gordon Brown's economic credibility and handed the argument to his enemies.
It was the biggest loss of control over fiscal policy and tax and spending that anybody now living can remember.
By the time of the last general election, Britain had the biggest deficit since the war. £160 billion.
You do need to just keep your eye on how much you are actually spending. You know, the what-if question of what if this slows down, how much margin have you got? But I have to say that, you know, there may have been people around who said spend less, but the majority, and certainly there was a political consensus, maybe that was a bad thing, but certainly a political consensus that we should be spending more, not less.
Not anymore. A new government has ushered in a new age of austerity.
Are the cuts going to hurt, Chancellor?
This is a dramatic change of political and economic strategy, and like the last Chancellor, he can only wait and watch and hope.
We have moved from an era when choices could be avoided to one where they simply have to be made.
The decisions we make will affect every single person in this country. And the effects of those decisions will stay with us for years.
Every day we hear about cuts to pensions, pay, services, all choices about who gets what. But some questions are still considered too explosive to ask, like why if you live in some parts of Britain, you'll get more spent on you than people in other parts. Take Scotland. Public spending is, on average, £10,212 per head, whereas in England it's £8,588. That's a gap of £1,624, just under 20%. So what difference does that extra money make? Well, one possible answer can be found here at Edinburgh University. It's fresh as fair. We can sign up to anything from tribal drumming to pole dancing. However much you pay to come here in tuition fees, which of course depends on where you're from.
I'm Anna and I'm from Yorkshire, and I pay at the moment about £1,700 a year.
I'm Matthew, I'm originally from London and I spend the same, it's about 600.
I'm Matt, I'm from Edinburgh and I pay nothing at all.
And looking very pleased.
I'm looking very pleased.
You have to preside over a student body, some of whom are paying and some are not.
Yes, I mean, we have huge conflicts and we have inequalities of fee level, but it shouldn't result in inequalities of educational provision, and that's the thing that we're making sure remains absolutely frontline.
And it's not just the difference between Scots and English people.
No, not at all. It's the difference between Scots and English. Also, Europeans still get it for free, even though the English are paying because of the EU. And then we've got international students who are paying through the roof fees to be with us in Edinburgh. So there are huge inequalities in the amount that people are paying, and they're inequalities that I don't believe should exist.
But those inequalities are going to get starker as fees rise. English and Northern Irish students arriving here next year could face a bill up to £36,000 more overall than their Scottish or European friends. Welsh students will pay less than that, but more than the Scots. And tuition fees are just one example of what Scots seem to get which the rest of Britain doesn't. Is that unfair or just a consequence of devolution? What is your message to an English parent who says, my child goes to Edinburgh University, pays £9,000, a Scot doesn't pay that? A Pole doesn't pay that? How's that fair?
Well, I would change your government in Westminster. You see, when I was an MP at Westminster, I voted against the Labour government introducing tuition fees. If I'd still been an MP at Westminster, I would have voted against the Tory and Liberal government introducing